Welcome to Beyond My Crisis. I'm your host, Ron Vivian.
And I'm Vivian Gaspar. We should be aware that we are doing everything possible to shed the light and uncover misconceptions around domestic violence. We are here today, and we're very honored and grateful to have with us here Sara Sencer McArdle. Sara Sencer McArdle has been a practicing criminal law attorney for over 35 years and a family law attorney for the last 15. Sara was an assistant prosecutor in Essex County, New Jersey for 22 years, and for the last 15, she has been in private practice. Thank you, Sara. It is so critical that we understand the good, the bad, and what the law has tried to do, and sometimes, unfortunately, with backlash in their efforts to protect victims from domestic violence.
Well, thank you for having me.
What I'd like to start off with is, what has happened? I know the laws have been to keep consistently and constantly evolving to help people. Has there been anything that's relatively new in the last few years alone?
Well, the Criminal Justice Reform Act came into being on January 1st, 2017. And with that act came new rules about who would be released for jail prior to trial and when. One of the parts of the law has to do with domestic violence charges. And people who now are charged with domestic violence do not automatically get bail. In fact, bail has almost been eliminated in this state. What happens now is if somebody's charged with domestic violence, almost invariably, the perpetrator is going to be sent to jail for at least 24 to 48 hours before they can get out. And they see that as a way to protect victims and let things calm down before a perpetrator is released.
Now, as an attorney who has been so entrenched in this for so many years, how do you feel about this law? Do you think it's an overall benefit, or does it have detriment to it?
It depends who my client is.
No, but is it overstepping our human rights or any violations of the Constitution going on here?
No, I'm sure there are no constitutional violations, but I'm not crazy about the law. I think that when there are de minimis crimes, one party scratches another, and the police must arrest under those circumstances, I don't think it's appropriate for that person to automatically be placed in jail for 24 to 48 hours.
So can we map out a scenario that might be common? A husband and wife
Husband and wife get into an argument.
Right.
The two of them bump heads. One of them has...
Figuratively.
No, literally bump heads. Okay, so one of them has a mark on their head. Happens to be the wife. Husband gets arrested. Husband's taken down to the municipal jail, charged, and shipped over to the county jail, where he remains 24 to 48 hours until they realize, wait a minute, this guy's never been in trouble. This guy has never not shown up to court, not a flight risk, and then he's released. In the meantime, he spent 48 hours in jail.
And it could be a doctor, could be a law enforcement officer
Absolutely.
that would be mandated to spend one night in jail, where previous to this enactment, they would get released quickly.
Correct.
But wait a second. If we're talking about this could be anybody in any situation,
Correct.
What could be the long-term detriment? And so, for example, if you're a law enforcement officer, you're just a police officer at home, you get an argument with your spouse, what's the long-term ramification of that?
Well, if you're a police officer, you can't have a gun until this whole thing is cleared up. So if you're convicted of an act of domestic violence, and you've got to separate acts of domestic violence from criminal charges which involve domestic violence, there's a difference. The police officer, if there's a TRO, a temporary restraining order, or a final restraining order, the police officer cannot have a gun.
So in this process, now, I understand there's over 30,000 law enforcement officers, just as police officers alone in the state. So it's a pretty common profession, and so that can affect a lot of people, but there's, I'm sure, other professions where that can have a long-standing implication. It's not just an inconvenience about being in jail a night or two, correct?
Anybody who's convicted of and has a final restraining order cannot have a gun.
Ever?
Ever.
Ever.
One of the things that happens when someone's arrested is the victim or the defendant are asked, not even if they're arrested, if they are exposed to a TRO, if a TRO is signed, the first thing that's asked is, does the perpetrator have weapons?
So-
and if they do, the police go and take the weapons.
So just for clarity, TRO stands for temporary restraining
Correct.
order, which is an allegation, not a conviction. So
Correct.
if someone says, I was hurt by this person, I fear for my life, and they go to the police station, and it's after hours, they call the judge up, they swear that they were a victim, and the judge can grant a temporary restraining order, and the police can go and arrest the so-called perpetrator and keep them in jail.
Well, hold on. If it's just a TRO, the police will go, they will remove the person from the house, they'll serve them with the TRO, and they'll search the house for weapons and take weapons. That is not a criminal offense. That's a family offense. If at the same time a criminal charge is signed, that is when the person will end up or may end up in the county jail.
And very often, a criminal charge is put up by the police officer if there's violence that occurs.
Well, if there's a scratch, if
Right.
there's an injury, the officers are forced to arrest.
Okay.
That's the law in the state of New
Is
Jersey.
it possible that this can happen? So, for example, can we just take a little bit of a step back and please help us by defining domestic violence? Because I understand that it's a lot more than somebody punches somebody else. There
Well-
has to be further definition.
Okay, an act of domestic violence is an act where some offense is committed, such as harassment, assault, trespass, criminal mischief, breaking something, punching holes in walls, for example. All of those are considered acts of domestic violence. False imprisonment, holding somebody in a room against their will. Obviously, serious aggravated assaults, homicide. Well, by then you're...
But even
Well,
withholding
yeah.
money, even like
Theft.
manipulating the other person unduly can be considered one of the aspects of the circle of violence.
That may be an aspect of the circle of violence, but that may not be a predicate act of domestic violence. Okay.
So, if, for example, and I'm just going to say husband because it's just a generality. Yes, it could go both ways. I'm sure there's many
Does go
situations
both ways.
where the wife is the perpetrator of domestic violence, not just a victim. So let's be clear. But so I've actually heard there's cases where if he withholds money and only gives enough to go shoe shopping or just make sure there's tight control, does that fit into it, or is just being unpleasant?
That does not fit into it. It may be emotional. It may be emotional violence, domestic violence, but it's not a predicate act of domestic
Because
violence.
there's no imminent threat to one's own physical safety.
Correct.
And so, what you had mentioned before, harassment. How would you define harassment?
Well, harassment is being defined and redefined. It's the repeated threatening behavior, I would say, is what would constitute domestic violence under the Domestic Violence Act. Name calling, but I mean, vicious name calling. You're
Yeah, curse words we're
Curse
not going to
words,
say
yeah.
here on television.
But,
right
but I
now.
think a takeaway, we could be on either side of the fence. We could say someone harmed us and want a temporary restraining order, or we can become the defendant. You help both sides, right?
correct. That's right.
If someone is accused of domestic violence and they have a TRO and the police come to the door knocking, what's the first thing they should do?
They should leave the house.
They should follow the
They
officers.
should follow the officers, leave the house, not fight, not be difficult.
Right.
Take the restraining order, find a place to stay, and these things are handled quickly.
Find a place to stay. Sometimes the place that they give them to stay is a prison cell
Well,
overnight.
Absolutely, if there's a criminal charge. If there's simply a TRO, there won't be.
And very often there are. both
I would
components.
say 50% of the
Okay,
time.
so in that 50% there is a criminal charge. What should they be aware of? What should or shouldn't they do?
They should not fight with the police. They should get hold of a family member, let them know what's going on, let them know where they are. if they can, because it's not always that easy, find their lawyer and have their lawyer work on it.
Okay, so this is a very intense subject. We do need to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to discuss what about the children. What is the implication if you're in the middle of a fight and there's children in the house? We'll be right back.
Anytime you can come into court and file for a change if there's a change of circumstances. We give an hour free consult. It's confidential. Find out what has to be done.
Welcome back to Beyond My Crisis. We're here with Sara Sencer McArdle.
We were talking about what is the process and what should and should not say when the police arrived. If it gets to that point, what's the best thing to do?
You know, that's a really interesting issue because most of the time I would give advice, be quiet, don't say anything. But I recently had a case where my client was told, don't speak to the police. Well, she and her husband were in a fight. He had injuries, she had injuries. Because she didn't speak to the police, she was the one who was charged with the crimes.
Does that make you look guilty if you're not talking? Because usually if you're a victim, you're like, oh my God, help me, this happened to me, and you're frantic and you're panicked. Does that make you look guilty if you don't say anything?
In that case, it did.
Wow.
So what's the real advice? I mean, most lawyers seem to say, don't say anything to the police, but that gives you culpability then.
Right, and at that point, when you're being taken out of the house, there may be a second side to the story. So it's difficult for us to give that kind of advice. Normally we would say, don't say anything.
So if you're not saying anything, how does that change? I mean, don't you want to feel like you want to give your side of the story? Because if you're aware that you have a bruise or a scrape or something, maybe you're like, no, don't leave the room, and you scratch at the person inadvertently. You're not trying to necessarily predicatedly say, let me hurt my ex, or, ex, hopefully not ex, but we don't know, maybe. But at that moment in time, your spouse, maybe you're just saying, hey, don't walk away from me. And you just, maybe they're wearing short sleeves or whatever.
Is that something
and they
you
end
should
up in a scrape. Well, it's a heated moment. You're not sitting here thinking out, you're upset. Maybe, you had some kind of impassioned whatever disagreement. But the kids might be upstairs in their bedrooms and they could hear everything. So, and now, unfortunately, somebody's called the police. If you're yelling so loud that the neighbors call the police and you didn't even do it yourself, do you say anything about does it make you look worse that your kids are upstairs hearing everything and they were just afraid to come down? I mean, how does that affect things?
Really, what's the advice?
I don't have a pat answer to this because both sides may have injuries. So I think if you have an injury, you show it to the police, But, if this is a very impassioned situation, or if you've been drinking, or if you've been involved in such activities such as
mind-altering.
Yes, mind-altering. You need to be careful and really think about, well, am I in my right mind right now?
But when it comes to domestic violence and the police are knocking at your door, don't make admissions to that. Say, my attorney has advised me not to say much about anything, so I really need her or his advice.
Right, except in that one case that I talked about where my client ended up in a heap of trouble because she let him do the other side do the talking.
But sometimes it's the way they express themselves. I'm not saying anything. My attorney says I can't talk.
No.
You got to be affable.
There may have been some of that night, and there was alcohol that night, and there was alcohol involved that night. So.
But were there children present anywhere at the scene? How does that make it worse?
So what's the advice for?
In this state, and probably many other states, the authorities view fighting in front of the children, especially physical fighting in front of the children, as a form of abuse to the children. Mm-hmm. And therefore, if the children are involved and see the Division of Child Protection or CPS or whatever we call it,
Child Protective Services.
Child Protective Services, will be called, and they will do an investigation to ensure that the children are not harmed by the witnessing domestic violence.
What if the children weren't in the room at the time it occurred? This big blown out fight that ended up inadvertently getting physical, not planned out. Maybe there's not a long-standing history of domestic violence. But what if they were in the living room downstairs and the kids are upstairs, then they could hear it? I mean, obviously people are screaming, they can hear it. Is that the same thing?
I think, yes, I think that
From the police's
division will
perspective.
be involved. The
Wouldn't-
police have to report if children are involved when there is a domestic violence.
So Child Protective Services will absolutely be called anytime there's a TRO that's issued. With children involved.
Usually.
With minor children involved.
Okay.
Usually.
So, Child Protective Services will almost always be called, and this is something people should be aware of. And maybe it's especially important of how they conduct themselves. Maybe it'll help stop some fights if people are aware and what the ramifications can be. Yeah, maybe it'll curb a little bit more excessive drinking too.
I think that something's going on in the house, children know about it, and parents need to protect their children. And it's very upsetting to children to have to listen to that kind of behavior on the part of their parents, and it frightens them.
And they shouldn't-
learn.
No,
they
they should
learn
be
too.
exposed to that.
They should not be exposed to that. And
We all agree.
I'm sure there's many, many children in the United States who are exposed to their parents fighting.
Unfortunately, it's probably a much higher percentage. And maybe there's some chemical changes that take place in their brain of these young developing children. If they've heard a lot of fighting repetitively, maybe they've had some physical changes in their brain.
I have no idea.
No, I'm just saying it could be far-reaching. We're going to take a little bit of a break, and we will be back to continue this much-needed discussion.
Back to Beyond My Crisis. We're here with Sara Sencer McArdle talking about domestic violence and how it can impact your family. One of the big things we just discussed was how alcohol and economic stress are causes for this energy that causes these incidents.
Absolutely. People go to work, they come home, maybe there's not enough money to pay the rent. Maybe there's not enough money to get the kid into college. All kinds of stressors affect people. Come home, have a couple drinks, and things spiral out of control due to the stressors and the anger within people that they can't do what they want to do and help their families. I recently had a case where a mom works all night. And she comes home and it's a Sunday and she needs to go to sleep. She wakes up, dad hasn't done a thing for the kids during the day. She asked him to make lunches or do whatever,
Right.
and he didn't take the kids out. She sees him sitting there playing on his computer and she explodes. And she ends up grabbing his shirt and she ends up getting arrested.
Wow.
She
And she's
didn't
the
end up in jail, but
And she's the hard worker, just so frustrated with
right.
the situation.
She was so frustrated with the situation. And somebody who would never do something like that, but lack of sleep, lack of having everything heaped on her, in her mind, caused her to go off.
So you're saying holistically, we need to maintain our health and well-being.
Of course.
Not
of
enough
course.
sleep is there's so many times the contributing factor to car accidents, and now this another
Illogical
reinforcement.
behavior.
When someone needs to defend themselves, so let's say we already had the argument, we're in the house, somebody got arrested, and now there's, what are the steps? I mean, there's a possible
somebody gets
restraining order.
Okay, the first thing that happens is they'll go down to headquarters, and or may happen is they'll go down to headquarters, and the victim will be offered a temporary restraining order. So they'll fill out a temporary restraining order. If there are injuries, the police will document the injuries and file a criminal complaint. So now you've got two actions, two separate actions in two separate courts. Some in the family court, some in the criminal court. I think people need to be aware that once there's a restraining order, you had best stay away, because it's a violation of a restraining order, and it's a charge, a criminal charge, to go back to the house, to call the person, to ask somebody else to call the person.
So how do you get your stuff?
Or even call the children.
You can't
right?
call the children.
If you have a temporary restraining order against you,
Right.
you cannot speak to your spouse or the people that were named on that restraining order.
That's correct.
And getting your stuff, you're not even necessarily allowed back into the house unless the police escort
Correct.
you for a few minutes.
For a very short period of time.
That's what I was going to say. If you have an argument, hypothetically, some evening, and now you're ushered out, you're arrested,
Right.
and, well, what do you do the next day? I mean, how long is a temporary restraining order in effect for?
Generally, you'll go to court within a couple days.
Days, okay.
However, nobody may be ready to pursue the case, so you'll get an adjournment. That can happen, and if the case takes a long time, if there's many witnesses, that can also go for days, weeks. I've had them go for a couple months.
So a temporary restraining order could be months?
I know
be.
specifically temporary restraining orders can take 3 months.
That's
to
correct.
cure.
That's correct.
So how does this person who was ushered out by the police, possibly most likely arrested, they spend 1 or 2 nights in jail, they get out
Or
of jail.
7 or 8.
Or 7 or 8 or 9.
10.
But what do they do then? They don't have access to their car keys, their car, their clothes, or what do they do next?
Well, they do get access to their car keys, because generally when you go to court the first time, you'll get some things that you need, but the important thing is you don't have access to your children. You may have to beg for supervised visitation. It depends how angry and how upset the victim is, and generally that person will dictate whether there's contact with the children, whether that contact is supervised or unsupervised, how often that contact occurs. It's very difficult.
Often the person that is given the temporary restraining order files another restraining order against.
That happens too.
So you can have a restraining order go both ways?
Absolutely. Mutual
That's common,
restraining.
isn't it?
It's not common, but it happens. It's not common, but
So how does
I've
that-
been involved in that, where one party files a restraining order and the other party does.
It sounds like if you don't have an attorney in that situation, you're making the biggest mistake.
Yeah, you need an attorney. In fact, we had a case where one party had a little scratch to his arm. The woman had a huge bruise to her arm, and they arrested the woman,
The one with the bruises?
the one with the huge bruise.
She was probably defending
the
herself.
person who had a scratch had a criminal charge against her. We went in and got an assault against the victim, and we got a temporary restraining order as well. And
Gotta
that
get
took
it.
a long time to work through the
But
courts.
without an attorney, she would have been sunk then. It would have been a bad
It would have been
result.
difficult for her to walk through the system.
Is there any other really important advice that our viewers should know about this?
There is a cycle of violence, and if people don't get treatment, that cycle of violence will reappear. So if you're a perpetrator, you need to get treatment and understand what's going on. And if you're a victim and you see a reemergence of this over and over, it's time to go get some help. And there are agencies that help both men and women deal with the problems of domestic violence and the suffering that they endure
Like the
from
Rachel
a
Coalition.
like the Rachel Coalition, Jewish Women Battered Services Better.
And there's several in each state. It's
Oh, there are many. in
doesn't
each
take. It's
state,
not.
I
And of
think.
course, there's the national hotline.
Right.
And of course, what's really important is to remember if there's children involved, and most times there is. What's really important is their mental welfare, because obviously, kids aren't going to just get over it easily. It's
Right.
very traumatizing for them to have witnessed the two parents they love, and regardless of whoever they deem is the culprit that may have initiated it, it just is not going to get better. It's not going to get cured if you stay and continue, and the children will have to re-witness repetitively.
And do you want your children to remember their childhood as one that's violent and argumentative and unhappy.
And then, of course, unfortunately, in addition to what they do remember, it could cause traumatic, long-standing PTSD issues. What if it causes them to have problematic memories in general? We don't know enough conclusive evidence of what the long-standing effects on children are for having just witnessed domestic violence, not that they were ever themselves the abused.
Right.
Thank you very much, Sarah.
Thank you,
We
Sarah.
really appreciate this very valuable insight.
Thank you for
Thank you.
having me.
When you and your spouse, your loved one are fighting, whether your children are in the house or not, you need to analyze, is this a domestic violence situation? Because naturally the police will not always be called. But if you feel that your fights have gotten more aggressive, if your fights have been repetitive, if you feel that your relationship is making you feel more sad than good, please at least contact the federal hotline, contact someone at one of your state agencies. They're extremely protective of your identity, and the best thing you could do is understand where you are and get help going forward. This is an epidemic, and it does affect so many people, and don't let it be you. Thank you for watching Beyond My Crisis.